Okay, why don't you start by introducing yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Dr. Sarah Alsawy-Davis, and I'm a clinical psychologist, and I specialize in trauma bonding and relationship problems. So these may be things to do with attachment issues, or it may be things around trauma that occur in relationships. Yeah, and I've been working in the field for nearly 2 decades, so it's been a long time.
Oh my God, okay, that's amazing. I actually haven't heard of enough people. Actually, I think one or two people that actually specialize in trauma bonding. I haven't heard of enough doctors specializing in trauma bonding. And I seriously love what you do because it's something people don't talk about enough. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's one of the major issues actually. I think it's almost like it's become quite normalized and romanticized. So the thing about trauma bonding is that you have such intense, amazing, beautiful, romantic, fantasized, idealized, it's like Hollywood love, which is
Absolutely.
glamorized by Hollywood, right? So you have these moments where everything is so magical. It's like Paris, and just everything is beautiful. It's like that sort of romantic image. So you have it really intensely beautiful,
Mhm.
but then you have the trauma, you have the plummets, you have the thing where it's actually really, really painful and really harmful.
Yeah.
But the issue in terms of why I think it's not really been spoken about too much is because a lot of people get sucked into it, and it's kind of become normalized in the sense that it's normalized that you kind of have to tolerate the difficult parts because you love each other so much. But actually what it is that that's a reflection of an addiction, and it's an addiction of the dopamine hit that you get when everything looks like a fantasy, as
Mhm.
opposed to actually looking at the reality of the relationship, that there's no security, there's no consistency. I actually don't know how you really feel about me. You only show me that you love me when I say that I'm walking out the door, and then when I'm having to tolerate the criticism, when I'm having to tolerate the abuse, that makes it really difficult. And I think one of the other things as well that I think make it really hard for us to really notice when it occurs is because of the shift in how people perceive sex. In terms of
Yeah.
Yeah, in terms of generations, because I suppose things like threesomes have become a lot more normalized, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Even though actually, if you look at what's really happening in a threesome, it's really to satisfy the man more than anything, really. It's really like, if we're talking about heterosexual relationships, more often than not,
Mhm.
yeah, right. So more often than not, the purpose of a threesome, the purpose of why even men get women, their girlfriends, their partners to watch porn is not necessarily for her enjoyment, but it's more to get her to enjoy it with him. And the reason why women do this
Mhm.
is because they're under this illusion that this is really normal, that this is okay. And so it's kind of like shifting how people approach
Mhm.
sex. And so when you've got this societal shift in general, it kind of makes it really hard for people to notice what is normal and what's abnormal. So over time, what happens is that these men who, and I'm saying men as a broad term, actually it could be any of the sexes, but the thing
I
is
get
that
it.
it gets people who are less likely to commit to relationships.
Mhm.
It gives them permission to have their girlfriend or their partner to say yes to other sexual activities or to other sexual encounters or to other sexual partners, and kind of normalize it as a part of their relationship.
Mhm.
And so the thing is that even things like that, because there's been a shift in terms of how people view sex and what's kind of more acceptable, it's almost like it dismisses how hurtful that can actually be. So like, just as a side note, as an example, like the number of clients, and I can't even tell you, it's probably 100% of the clients I've had, but the people that I have worked with who've been quite open about, oh well, my partner brought a prostitute home one day and we just ended up having a threesome, or like, you know, but it's almost said like quite casually, or quite like, I'm not comfortable with this, but it's kind of normal, right? Or like it's kind of like, yeah. But the thing is though, is that there is a massive shift in society where it is kind of normalizing the edges of this. And so when you're trauma bonded, because there is because of the backdrop of all the trauma, because of the criticism, because of the hostility and the abuse, and what ends up happening is that the person who is more vulnerable in that relationship, they go through this process called cognitive dissonance. And I'm not sure if you've ever heard of cognitive dissonance.
I think it's something that happens a lot in narcissistic relationships, right?
Yeah.
So if you're like, you start like almost justifying bad behavior.
Exactly. So people absolutely do this when there are other sexual encounters. So for example, if the person who's the narcissist, the abusive party, is saying, hey, I want to go to a sex club, if you say no, you're denying their sexual desires, their sexual urges, their needs, their basic needs. And so you end up being the bad guy, right? That's kind of how it gets played out. And so with the cognitive dissonance, what happens to the empath, the more vulnerable person, they kind of think, okay, well, I'm not happy with, like, as in, I feel I know that I feel a bit uncomfortable about this. But then I've almost got two options. I either see that this is a form of infidelity, and basically it's disrespect to me and to what it is that I want. I either see it in this light, or I see it that actually my partner just is doing what they need to do for their own urges. And so if I am somebody who's already feeling really vulnerable and I'm really struggling to stand up for myself, and I've already been coerced so much, and I've been gaslit so much, and it's kind of really difficult to have control over the situation, I'm likely to go for option B and say, you know what, no, this has nothing to do with me. This is actually they're just trying to satisfy their own urges, they're trying to satisfy their own need. And so we kind of dismiss what's actually going on in reality, and the dismissal is, I feel disrespected. That's what's actually going on.
I think it can get really confusing because a part of your brain tells you that it's okay and you want it. I don't know, it almost makes you feel like you're the one who wants it. So that's when manipulation and gaslighting comes into question, and they do it so well. You start believing it's you who wants it. So
Yeah. And so and that's also a process of self-gaslighting. So I think a lot of people talk about gaslighting in terms of, okay, well, my partner, this person, whoever it is, they're questioning, or they're making me doubt my perception of reality. But the thing is that within a trauma bond, you do that to yourself. You start questioning your own reality. And so if you have an uncomfortable feeling about something, there's the issue around cognitive dissonance, but then after that you start then kind of dismissing that question, that doubt, that discomfort that you have, and you kind of say like, oh, maybe I'm being too much, maybe I'm asking too much, maybe like, this is actually normal and I need to adjust myself. And so with that process, we dismiss our own perception of reality. So that's kind of like we're gaslighting ourselves. But then also, if we're faced with something that's either really painful, which is the truth, or we can remain in a disconnected state, and that's kind of like it's a form of self-preservation, that actually we're going to end up going for that. Cognitive dissonance, the reason why we might justify somebody's bad behavior, or the reason why we are self-gaslighting, even though it's obviously not healthy, but at the same time, when you feel unable to leave that toxic cycle, it is the only way that you can defend yourself. It's the only defense mechanism that you have at the moment. And so what it does is that it's almost like it preserves you, well, it preserves both your ego and your essence away from the reality, which is actually really painful. And so the more distance that you have, the more tolerable it is to remain in that situation, even though actually it's incredibly harmful in the long run.
So, do you think someone could inherently be co-independent before a trauma bonding? Like, for example, let's say there's one partner and there's another, and there is no direct sense of control. For like, it's sort of like very underneath the surface. So it's not like a direct, hey, you can't do this.
Yeah.
So the codependent feels
Yeah, yeah, and it's yeah, and just as a side note, so all trauma bonds are very, very subtle when they start off. Like
okay.
it's quite, yeah, yeah. So basically, so I'm not sure if you're aware, but 93% of what we communicate is nonverbal. Right, so it's nothing to do with what it is that we say. So it's not to do with you can't do this, so it's never going to be like an explicit thing, but it might be a look, it might be like, it might be the
That
energy, it'll be
body.
the vibe, it'll be, yeah, the body language, it'll be so many other things, but it's only 7% really is what we actually say verbally. So more often than not, when somebody gets attracted to a trauma bonded relationship, like the reason why an empath would be attracted to a narcissist, but also why a narcissist is attracted to an empath, is because of the subtle signs that they both give off before entering the actual relationship. That's the reason. So and it's similar with codependency as well. So let's say, for example, someone who, okay, so the reason why they'd be attracted to each other is the empath tends to have a long history of difficult situations where they believe I have to work really, really hard to care about other people, to show them that I care in order to have attention, in order to be seen, in order to be loved, in order to be acknowledged. So the empath grows up in a situation where they believe that they will only be acknowledged or that they will be loved if they give a lot of themselves to somebody. Okay, that's their belief system, and that stems from childhood and anxious attachment styles. Whereas the narcissist is actually really fragile. Underneath all of the layers of grandiosity, they're actually really fragile and they have a really low self-worth. And so they believe, I need somebody to always show me that they love me in order for me to believe it. And so the reason why they end up being a match is because this person here, the empath, is constantly, they believe that they have to always show other people, I love you, I want to help you, I want to do this and this and this for you. They believe that they have to always do that in order to get love. But these guys, the narcissists, they believe I have to have a lot of evidence, I have to have a lot of validation in order to make sure that this person really does care about me. And so subtly they become a perfect match because the empath also expects the other person to reject them. They also expect that they are hard to love and that other people are going to show them that they're hard to love. And a narcissist, when they're really grandiose, that they're putting up high expectations and they're saying, you know what, I find people really hard to love. And so again, it becomes a match for these two because the empath is saying, I'm struck, like I can't be loved, or I have to meet certain expectations to be loved. And the narcissist is saying, I have these expectations for me to love you. And so again, they become almost perfect matches in a way because they fit each other's subconscious templates. But in terms of your question about like the subtle behaviors, so all of these subtleties come out in terms of how it is that we even present ourselves. So for example, the person who's a narcissist or has narcissistic traits, when they meet people, they tend to present themselves as being superior in some way. They tend to present themselves as having really great qualities and having high expectations, having high standards. And so for an empath, that's actually really attractive because they believe other people have high expectations and have high standards. And so it's kind of it, and so it's a subconscious match. It's almost like, you know, you're doing a puzzle and you've got a particular shape and this person is showing you the shape and you're like, hey, you know what, I know this shape and I'm going to fit in.
Right.
And so basically the empath sees this narcissist who has really high expectations and they're like, hey, this is familiar, I get this. And so they get drawn into that. But the inverse is true. So let's say, for example, if the empath comes across somebody who is really nice to them, is an empath as well, gives them so much attention, so much care, and is consistent, the empath doesn't know what to do with that because it feels a bit awkward. Because yeah, and they're kind of like, is this really real? Like, I don't know if I really believe this, because what I am expecting is other people to have really high expectations and I have to work really hard to meet these expectations. But if you're being nice to me without expectations, like it doesn't quite compute, it doesn't match up. And so the empath tends to be kind of repulsed by other empaths or other people who are really consistent and who are securely attached. They're kind of like, this doesn't make sense. I either get the ick and I don't find you attractive, or I'm going to test you. I'm going to really test you and I'm going to push you and I'm going to pretend to hate you. I'm going to pretend to break up with you. And it can kind of go the other way. And they start, yeah, and they start to be kind of nasty to the person who's securely attached or to the person who's consistent because they don't believe it. But then obviously that person then leaves because they're like, I'm not going to get treated like this. And so when they leave, the empath is like, oh yeah, I knew it. It was never real. And so it kind of validates their original belief in that I have to work really hard in order to be loved. Otherwise, any love that I get isn't really real. So it becomes a bit of a, I know I'm moving around different topics, but it kind of becomes a really messy territory. And so that's also part of the reason why people don't really recognize when they get trauma bonded or even slipping into these patterns. Yeah.
In that sense, I know this is a weird statement to make, but in that sense, I think a narcissist and an empath are quite similar, actually. They are,
Yeah.
I mean, I know they're completely in the opposite, but they're actually kind of on the same, the underline is the same thing, you know?
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right, because the underlying core issue for both of them is low self-worth.
Mhm,
That's the core problem that they both have.
mhm,
But the coping mechanisms that we see on the surface in terms of how it is that they behave, but also personality traits,
mhm,
is that the empath works really hard to try and please people, to avoid rejection, to avoid criticism. And the narcissist works really hard to make themselves better than other people, to
mhm.
avoid criticism. And so they have to present themselves as being better than, so that's the reason why they're so grandiose. And so that's why they also have to establish a power imbalance, because if they are more powerful in any relationship, if they are seen as better than the other person in any relationship, it's really hard to question them because they're constantly protecting their
Right.
position of power, position of dominance. But the reason why they're holding that position of dominance so much is because they're really fragile in terms of their self-worth. They get really, really anxious that somebody is going to see them for who they really are. And that to them is frightening.
Mhm.
But interestingly, that's also part of the reason why the trauma bond gets maintained, because the empath at some point sees the vulnerability of the narcissist. They see that actually this narcissist is someone who's really injured and they just want to be loved. They just want to know that they're worthy.
Right.
And so the job of the empath is to care for that is to care for that core, right? And so you're just looping around continuously. But what happens is that when they start to care, when they start to show a lot of love, for someone with narcissistic tendencies, that's really intimidating. And so they want to back out, they want to gain distance from this relationship, from this person. And because again, they're testing, they're checking if it's real, they're not sure if it's real or that it's going to last a long time. And so, and they're not sure if it's real because they still don't know if they could truly be loved.
Right.
And so that's when the power imbalance is reinforced. That's when they push. That's when they criticize. That's when they manipulate. That's when, often people with narcissistic tendencies will make a lot of promises like, hey, let's get married, let's have children, let's do this and this and this. But as soon as you start to say, okay, I've been looking at places to rent, they're like, hold up, we never said this. We never said this. And it's kind of like a full backtrack. Right. And but all of that is to gain distance, because as soon as things get too close, as soon as it becomes real, it's like, oh no, I can't, I literally can't tolerate this. I'm looking for the exit.
It's an endless sort of cycle, honestly. But it's the power struggle that kind of makes the chemistry really insane, though.
So yeah, because that's part of the thing, right? Because people do have this real intense sexual urge towards each other. Like it's really powerful and really overwhelming. And part of that is because for okay, just as a backdrop to this, just to give it a bit more context so it makes sense.
Okay.
People who end up as adults becoming either highly empathic or with narcissistic tendencies, the type of upbringing that they would have had would have been incredibly stressful. There wouldn't have been a lot of love, or love would have been conditional. So, for example, they may have had inconsistent parents who kind of gave them love some of the time, only if they achieved really good grades in school or if they did this or that, but they wouldn't have felt always loved. There may have been abuse within childhood. More often than not, there would have been neglect and absence, right? So one of the parents or both parents may not really have been that available, either physically or emotionally. But what that does in a child's brain is that it elevates the level of corticotrophin releasing factors. So it elevates basically stress hormones. That gets cycled into the brain, into the system. But what that also does is that it makes certain parts of the brain hypersensitive to stress. So anything that feels stressful, the brain is going to automatically light up far more than an average person who's had a healthy upbringing. So it's particularly around the limbic system. So the amygdala, the hypothalamic pituitary axis. Anyway, there's a certain part of the brain that gets really, really sensitive to anything that might be a sign of stress, anything that might be a sign of threat. But also, when you meet somebody who is a potential partner or someone that you're getting into a relationship with, whether that be friendship, romantic, family, anything, there's also the neuropeptide called oxytocin. And so oxytocin, like I think commonly it's known as the love hormone or the bonding hormone, but basically what it does is that it helps you to get attached to the person in front of you. It helps you to develop a relationship with the person in front of you. And it can get released in any sort of relationship, okay? So it doesn't have to be romantic.
Okay,
but
so
that part, pardon?
It gets released in friendships as well.
Yeah. So it can get released in friendships. Yeah. But the thing is that it's very context dependent how it gets released. So when you're in a stressful situation and there's somebody who you're bonded to, it gets released in a very different way. In the sense, what happens is your brain literally associates love and attraction with stress. And so what happens on a chemical basis is that your brain literally starts to get wired to believing that I can only really experience love if it is
Right.
laced with so much stress and threat. Right. And so when people say, oh, but we have crazy sex after making up, after an argument or whatever, like, that is a massive sign of a trauma bond. And the reason why that happens is because you're incredibly stressed, you're feeling under threat, you've been attacked, you've been criticized, you've been this and this and this, all of the stuff that would have happened in the argument. But at the same time, you're also bonded to this person. And so what happens chemically, but also what happens subconsciously, is that you associate that this stress is evidence that this love is true. And even though I'm saying it right now and it doesn't sound logical, I know it doesn't make logical sense, but
No,
this
but
is
again,
literally
I
how
see, I know, I get it though. I do, I get
this is how the brain gets wired, but this is
it.
also how physiologically it gets wired. And it also gets wired not only for that, but also when you're in a trauma bond, and also this would have happened in childhood. So let's say, for example, if you were only loved or only shown love and care, if you if you did really well in school, let's say, and you got a bag of sweets, right, because you got an A one day or whatever it is, you would also get a dopamine hit in that moment, but you would also get adrenaline in that moment. So what happens is that when you're in a trauma bonded relationship as an adult, you've got the oxytocin, you've got the cortisol, you've got all the stress hormones and the love hormones happening at the same time, but you also have a dopamine surge that happens when you make up and when they promise that things are going to be magical, when they start to romanticize and fantasize about the potential of what the relationship could be. And so because the reason why you're hooked in is because of the fantasy, right? Is because that actually it's so magical, this relationship. And so when you're thinking about that, the brain can't distinguish what's real and what's fantasy. And so it believes that it's real in that moment. And so the dopamine gets released along with the oxytocin, and you need that when it comes to sex and in terms of increasing your sexual desires. And so again, it gets you hooked in. And so that's why sex feels so amazing in those moments. But and it's all chemical, but at the same time, it's what keeps you trauma bonded.
I
That's the entire cycle, and it just happens again and again and again. But when you meet someone who's consistent, who is, you know, the same every day, and who sends you messages, who doesn't ignore you, doesn't criticize you, they have open conversations, but they're also not giving you that amazing fantasy that you're desperate for, that you've romanticized about, you kind of feel like it's a bit boring. And the
Oh,
thing is that it's a turn off for a lot of people, and so they really struggle to get their head around it. And so what happens in that moment is that you don't get the massive dopamine hits, because dopamine is quite out of all the pleasure chemicals that we have, dopamine is the one that gives you a massive spike, but it also depletes as kind of like a drug. Whereas if you have something like serotonin or endorphins, they get stabilized, and so that it's not as high, so you don't feel as excited, but you kind of feel good, but it's kind of middle ground, mid-range. And so when you meet somebody who's consistent, they're giving you mid-range, but because of your history, because of what you've known and what you've learned about love, you're expecting the high, you're expecting that massive hit,
right.
but subconsciously you're also expecting that low as well.
Ah, okay. Oh, so I just have to ask you because do you think, like, suppose someone is constantly in a trauma bond, they could develop ADHD over time?
That they could develop ADHD?
Yeah.
That's an interesting question. So ADHD is a neurodivergent condition. And I mean, research is still ongoing around it anyway, but typically it tends to be something that somebody is already born with.
Right. Okay.
So it's unlikely that it would develop because of a trauma bond.
Okay.
But
Mhm.
people with ADHD can be at higher risk of getting into a
Also,
trauma bonded
trauma.
relationship. Yeah. And the other thing as well to mention, just talking about genetics, is that people who are, let's say people who are parents, or like people, if they've experienced a trauma, they grow older and then they have children,
Yeah.
traumas can be genetically inherited.
Oh, traumas.
Yeah. Yeah, which I know
No,
sounds
no,
crazy.
I'm not. I'm open. At this point, I
Yeah,
think
yeah,
anything
yeah,
is
yeah,
possible.
yeah.
Anything is possible. So, oh, I didn't know
Yeah.
trauma.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So traumas can be genetically inherited, and there's a whole line of study around epigenetics where basically it shows that because of traumas that we experience, it literally changes our genetic coding
Oh,
in terms of certain genes and alleles that get activated and deactivated. And what happens is that when we have a child, when we give birth, that child is 50% us and 50% our partner.
yeah.
And what happens is that some of the genetic coding that has stored the trauma response gets passed down into the child. And so when people talk about generational trauma, I know a lot of people talk about it as if it's stories that have been told and circumstances that they're in, which is totally true. Like all of that stuff does contribute, but it's also biologically ingrained. And it's not to say that that can't change, because it absolutely can change, but it's just to emphasize how important it is for us to do our healing work, because actually we could read, like the reality is that we can pass it on. And so it's not just it's obviously it's really important for us to do our own healing work for ourselves, for our own benefit, but it's also vital that we do it for the benefit of our children, because actually it would be doing them a disservice. And so part of how it manifests itself is that we're all genetically programmed to be able to regulate our emotions to a certain degree. So let's say, for example, I don't know if you know someone in your life, in your circle, who is always chilled out, who's always calm, they deal with stress really well. Like, can you think of someone who's like that in your life?
I think that would be me actually.
Okay. So perfect. Right. Okay, let's use that.
I panic
And
on
then
the inside, but I don't really show people that.
okay. So let's say that you're actually really well balanced, and you're pretty chilled, you're able to deal with stressful situations really well. Now let's think of somebody else in your life who has a really low tolerance to dealing with difficult situations.
I can think of many.
Okay. You don't have to share here, but that's fine. Okay, so let's say, okay, right, so you've got two ends of the spectrum, okay? And sometimes it may be two people who are actually really closely related, like a brother and a sister. Like, for example, you might have someone who's really chilled and then somebody who's constantly stressed, right? But basically what that shows is the let's say emotional regulation is on a scale. I'm going to use this as an example, but let's say it's on a scale of 1 or 0 to 100. Okay, so 0, I have no ability to deal with stress. Like I get stressed out really, really easily and very quickly. And 100 is I am able to deal with stressful situations, and I'm able to tolerate it, and I'm able to move through it and get to the other side. Okay, so 100% is I am really resilient. So let's say this is the scale. Now, what happens in terms of our genetic coding is that our genetic coding determines the range that we get born at. So, for example, I might have the genetic range of only being able to do 20 to 40%.
Okay.
on the scale.
Mhm.
Or somebody else might be born with a genetic range of actually I'm between 80 and 100% in
Mhm.
terms of how I deal with stress, my resilience levels. And so genetically we're born with a certain level of range, and depending on the actual life circumstance that we're given, that will determine the exact number within that range. But let's say if we've got generational trauma, what would happen is let's say hypothetically I was born with between 70 and 90%. Okay, so I'm really resilient the way that I was born,
Okay.
but I experienced trauma during a relationship. Yeah.
Okay.
So let's say I experienced trauma within the relationship as an adult. Okay. And so instead of me having the emotional resilience range of 70 to 90%,
Mhm.
I now have the emotional range of 30 to 40%. I've kind of gone down the scale quite a lot. But what happens is that if I don't resolve that, it goes down even further. It can actually go down to 20 to 30%.
Oh
And then
dear.
when I have a child, the child would end up inheriting that 20 to 30% as well.
Oh crap.
And
Okay.
so that's how it occurs genetically, in terms of how trauma gets passed on.
Honestly, it's really sad that people don't take healing seriously. They don't take it seriously, and they don't really realize the impact it really has on themselves, on their children, on the people around them. It's ridiculous. Um, but
And
in terms of trauma bonding, um, I know this is controversial, but is it love? Now, I like because suppose you are the person that is trauma bonded in the situation. Um, if after the entire dynamic, you have to come to terms with the fact that wait, are you telling me I didn't even love this person? Like the fact, like coming to terms and saying that this is not even love can be probably the most heartbreaking part of the whole
yeah,
um
and
dynamic.
that's
So do you think that would make it worse, telling someone that this is not love?
I think this is exactly the reason why people don't heal. I think that's exactly the reason why people do not take the step towards healing.
Okay.
Because to take the step to heal, you also have to recognize that what happened was a fantasy in your mind. That the love that you believed that was so real is that you were in love with an idea, or you were in love with the potential of who that person could be. But sadly, the reality that you experienced was actually abusive. Sure, and you may have really enjoyed certain parts of it, and you may have really loved moments of it, and you may love the person in terms of their humanity, just because you love a human because they are flawed but they're also good, and you know that they're good, both good and bad. So you may love that person,
Mhm.
but it depends on how it is that we define love, really, because the thing is that there are so many different types of love, and also love is both an emotion and it's an action. So for me to love somebody, I have to behave in a way that is loving to that person, and I have to give that love.
Mhm.
But then I can also love this person in front of me for who they are and for their characteristics and their qualities. And that's where it becomes really difficult. And yeah, there is a lot of controversy about this. Can't say the word now. But yeah, there are a lot of difficulties around this, and that's because realistically the person does experience love, but they experience love more often than not around the potential of what that person could have been, around the good parts of their characteristics, as opposed to the abuse that they received. Like, they don't necessarily love the abuse, they kind of
Okay.
tolerate it to get to the better point. But true love in all of its forms would include intimacy. And when I say intimacy, I mean emotional intimacy. I mean connection,
Right.
mental intimacy. It would include passion. It would include commitment. Those are the three key elements that love would involve. And so commitment, for example, that would also include being consistent with one another. And that's where you build trust. That's where you're able to then start expressing vulnerability and to really show yourself for who you are. And if you're able to do that, then it opens the door for the emotional and mental connection. And so it's kind of it's love in itself is constantly reinforcing itself, but it can only do that in a healthy container. And so you can both act in love and love the person in front of you. But when it's a trauma bond, the door for emotional commitment is shut. Emotional connection is shut. The door for commitment is also shut. And so it becomes really hard to truly love that person or to truly love that relationship because it's in such turmoil. But I think this is also part of the reason why people really are hesitant about taking the steps towards healing, because even though like consciously, logically, they know that they need to do something, but at the same time emotionally they don't want to let go of that beautiful image that they had in their mind. They don't want to let go of that because that was too painful to let go of.
Because I think the fantasy is something very difficult to grieve, because I think real people are a little easier to grieve because the fantasy can keep going on and on in your head. You can keep creating it um,
Yeah.
much as you want. So I think grieving something that's not real is just something very insane. But yeah, I think what you said makes so much sense. I think you can still label it as I care about this person, or I like this person, or I'm even infatuated. But calling it love in itself, I don't know. I think yeah, there are many other words, but love is probably not the right.
Yeah, and I think do you know what though? I do think infatuated is probably a good word for this actually, just because that is what it becomes. It becomes almost like an obsession, in that you're always thinking about this person. This person's always on your mind. This is yeah, this is it's all consuming. It's all consuming, and it's all consuming also from a neurological perspective because your body is constantly pumping out all these chemicals,
Correct.
and so that's what you end up being drawn into. That's what you get attracted to. um and it's again, I think, I think one of the difficulties that I personally and professionally see is that we don't get taught this stuff in school. Like we don't get taught anything about emotional regulation. We don't get taught anything about relationships. We don't get taught anything about what is safe, what is healthy. Like we don't really get taught any of that stuff. We get taught about how to figure out the right angle of a triangle, but we don't get taught how to figure out stuff that is actually going to help us in adulthood and life. And this in itself becomes really difficult because we get shown a lot of fantasy, Hollywood love stuff on film, and it's just, and even on social media, on Instagram, on Facebook, whatever it is, and then you have these images where it looks like unbelievable, amazing love, and that it's so intense, it's so passionate, it's so like yeah, it's this fantasy that you see, and that is always held as an ideal. But the only people who can actually afford that, let's say the people who can afford that, the people who can present that, the people who want to present that tend to be people with narcissistic tendencies because they're aiming for the very top. And so you're literally being presented that as being the ideal standard for love, whereas actually love is so much deeper than that. Love is to do with how safe you feel, because if you don't feel safe, if you don't feel secure, if you don't know where you stand to somebody, if you don't know what they really think about you, like how you don't even have your foundation of being safe in a relationship in order to experience love. Like the foundation isn't even there. It's like building a house on sand. It's gonna sink. Like it's not gonna work because the foundation needs to be safety. It needs to be trust.
I think that would be probably like the first sign. I'm not talking about people who have personality disorders, but if you are somewhat like regulated and like you like someone asks you like about your relationship and like how the other person feels about you and you're actually very confused and you can't really understand or like talk about how it really is. I think if confusion, I think usually would be the first sign of a trauma one, I feel.
Yeah, yeah, I would say confusion is a massive thing, and a lot of people, oh God, honestly, I get a lot of messages from people saying, um, is this person, when they start to see that those mixed signals and they're not really too sure how the other person feels, and and they get the confusion, they ask me questions like, has this person lost interest in me, or are they actually really busy? Like, have they actually got other stuff going on? Or they'll ask something like, oh, well, I think that this person's really interested in me, but I think they're really struggling emotionally themselves. So I really want to help them out. I want to make sure that they're okay.
Mhm.
And I'm there like, okay, first of all, you're not their therapist. You shouldn't be their therapist. Second of all, if they're giving you mixed signals, that in itself is a signal. Like that in itself is a
That's
message.
what
The
I
fact
want
that
to.
it's mixed. If they can't, and I remember what a client many years ago, she was saying about this relationship, this person that she was with, and she was really, really devastated because she was so attached to this guy and he hadn't responded to her for a week. And so and she was really worried. She was even like googling news stories to make sure that he was alive, he was safe, like he wasn't in an accident. She was kind of like really, really worried, right? And the thing is that this person was totally fine, he just wasn't responding to her. And but the response that she got at some point was, sorry, I've been really busy. And then I said to her, did he not have a single 60 seconds at any point during that to send you a message? Right. And it's like, I get it, people are busy, and I get it, time runs away with you. Like, I totally get that. But the thing is, you know what? I don't I don't believe there is such a thing as time management. I know that people always talk about time management. I personally think that that's garbage. It's not about time management. It's about priority management. And the thing is that if it is a priority, it will be a priority. You will automatically spend time on it. And so it depends really on what becomes priority to you in that moment. And so, for example, in that instance, him responding to her wasn't a priority to him. It just wasn't. He was unable to communicate that. And she was just left guessing. She was in the dark. And even though in her mind, he was massively a priority to her, because she kept wondering, like, is he okay? Is he safe? Is he this? Is he that? Like, how does he feel about me? Da, da, da. And she was kind of all consumed by this. But in that moment, she, like, in her mind, he was a priority to her, but she just wasn't that present in his mind.
Mhm.
And so that in itself is a sign.
The main
But sadly, people get hooked into it because, again, like I was talking about before, empaths are programmed from a really young age. I have to work really, really hard to be present in someone's mind.
right.
And so they get attracted to people who may be a bit neglectful or who may be
Avoiding.
inconsistent, because they believe that I have to work really, really hard to please this other person.
So honestly, I'm gonna ask you the toughest question here. How do you actually break a trauma bond? Because it can actually feel so addictive, and the depression, the post-depression, and like the physical symptoms, and there's so much that goes on with breaking trauma bonds. Um,
Yeah.
how do you
Yeah.
actually go through with it? Because almost, and it almost also starts feeling very boring if the chaos is lost. If like
Yeah, it feels really boring, right? And so people are, yeah. So okay, so there are so many ways. Sorry, there are so many different things that need to happen in order to heal.
Okay.
And so one of the first things that I would say is it really needs to be felt in the body. So like I said, there's a lot of different chemicals that occur when you're trauma bonded that keep you hooked into the trauma bond, that make you excited and attracted to the chaos.
Okay.
And that's what you attach the love to. And so the boring relationship that's kind of consistent, you're like, oh, not really interested, right? So one of the first pillars really in terms of, in fact, you know what, before I go into that, the initial thing is that you have to make the commitment to yourself that you want to heal. And I emphasize that because the thing is that a lot of people say they want to heal, but they really struggle to make the commitment to healing. And they struggle to make the commitment because they are so infatuated by this person. They're still latching on to the fantasy that it could have been. They're really worried about it coming to an end, the fact that they invested so much and it's coming to nothing. They're really anxious about all of these different things that they don't really want to make that commitment to themselves. But they also may not want to make that commitment to themselves because they don't feel like they're worthy enough to be healed, to be loved truly as they are. They don't believe that it's possible to have a healthy relationship where someone is consistent and really loves them without it being, without there being a hidden agenda. They don't really believe that stuff. And so that's something that needs to happen first, is that the person needs to acknowledge, you know what, healing is going to be difficult because it's not easy. I'll be honest, it really isn't easy. You have to acknowledge that it's going to be difficult. There are going to be times when it's uncomfortable, but I am still making the commitment to myself to go through this process. So that's the first thing. Second thing, which I started talking about, is actually somatic. So the trauma is always held in the body.
Okay.
Always, always, always. So even if years pass by and I forget about certain instances or it's not really present in my mind, the thing is that the body will always respond. And so what will happen is that in future relationships, or even with this same person, whatever it is, you are going to be triggered. You're going to feel really anxious. You're going to feel panicked. You're going to feel attracted to certain people. But all of this stuff happens physiologically, and it's going to pull you back into the trauma bond. So really there has to be somatic work that's done. So some of the somatic work would be things like so there's certain I'm just mindful of time, so I won't have time to go into it here, but there's certain exercises where you would have to go into some elements of the trauma, but there's also emotional and physiological processing of the trauma. So it's like, how do you tap into certain trauma points that are in the body, and how do you allow them to be released? And so that needs to be gone through a few times, and that just helps to physiologically relieve the trauma, but also it helps to reduce the cortisol levels, the baseline stress that you're experiencing.
All right.
Okay, so that's another element. The second element really is around unconscious and subconscious beliefs. So it's around, why is it that you believe you have to work extremely hard to be loved by somebody? Right, and it's really tapping into the core of that. It's tapping into the core of your self-worth. Why is it that you believe that your self-worth is dependent on other people saying that you're worthy? And really exploring that link, as well as getting attracted to other people who show you that you're not worthy. Actually, is this a healthy thing for you? Because 95% of actions, and also 95% of the reason why we get attracted to somebody is subconsciously driven. We're not even that conscious about what's going on. So the other part of the work is really looking at our subconscious thoughts and our subconscious mind. And a lot of that would be childhood work as well, because a lot of these processes come from childhood. One of the other elements as well is processing emotionally what is going on for you. So emotionally, it would be things that are that are extremely triggering in the sense that, so the best way I can explain it is if you have one situation, but two different people who are facing the same problem, more often than not, you're going to get two different responses depending on the person. Okay. And the reason why there are two different responses is because one person is better equipped emotionally and the other person isn't. And so for one person, they're totally fine with the situation, but then for the other person, it's a trigger. The situation is a trigger for them, an emotional trigger. And so part of the healing work is also figuring out what are emotional triggers and being able to increase your resilience to be able to deal with that.
Okay.
And then one of the other elements as well, so there's two more elements. So one of the other elements really is around attachment-based work, because all of the relationships that we have is based on our attachment styles and patterns. And so part of the attachment-based work is really examining what is it that gets hooked in, what is it about us that gets hooked in with other people, but also developing secure attachments and tolerating the discomfort of boring. And I know that might sound a bit counterintuitive, but it's almost tolerating what it would be like to be consistent and testing that out and really seeing what the responses are, because you're ultimately trying to create a safe base for somebody. Yeah, because somebody who's securely attached, if they meet a narcissist or if they meet someone who's inconsistent in their relationship style, they'd be like,
Nah.
see you later, like, you know, I'm not in this, I'm out. So it's actually, how do we process and how do we shift your attachment style so we can get to that place of being securely attached. And then the final thing is around examining self-sabotaging behaviors, because we screw ourselves over, right? So our logical brain might see something, but if emotionally that's the thing that's pulling us to do something that's actually harmful for us in the long term, we are going to get pulled into doing self-sabotaging behaviors. So that becomes really painful as well.
Okay. Thank you so much for that. And
No, my absolute pleasure. My pleasure.
and
And
I
thank you for having me. Thank you for hosting this. I'm very grateful.
thank you so much. And we just had one more last question to end the thing.
Hmm.
Um, I don't know if this is a real thing or something that people talk about, but can you talk about trauma bonding with a parent? Because wouldn't that technically be the origin of
Yeah. So yeah. No, absolutely. So you can absolutely, yeah. No, you're absolutely right. So with a parent, it so you can be trauma bonded to anyone. So it could be with a parent, it could be with a sibling, it could be romantic, it could be friends. Although friends is less likely, just because you have a lot more choice and autonomy. But yeah, it can absolutely happen. I think the only difference with a parent is that sometimes the highs are not as intense, they're not as gratifying. And part of the reason for that is because you don't have the sexual contact. Part of the reason is because you don't have the I mean, I'm talking about obviously when there's no, if there's sexual abuse, this is a different realm, but yeah, you don't have the sexual contact, and you might not necessarily have the level of intensity because it's a much longer term relationship and you're seeing them day in, day out, typically. So it may not, so the highs and the lows may not be as intense because you're not getting the intense highs as you would do with a romantic partner. But at the same time, you can get the highs and the lows. So you do still get a bit of a dopamine hit, and you do get the crashes with the abuse, the criticism. But it's just in terms of the strength, it may not feel as strong as it does with a trauma bond. So with a parent, it may feel easier to break or easier to get into a healthier cycle, simply because you're not being reinforced as much.
Okay, right.
Yeah, or people step away from it, and that's okay, because sometimes people need to, and that's okay as well.
Okay. So for someone who probably, let's say, has a narcissistic parent, do you think maybe a first step to healing before like starting going even further because romantic relationships are a little more difficult to deal with? Breaking the trauma bond with your parent could be your first step to.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it all boils down to self-worth. It all boils down to how good enough I feel to be loved by somebody without conditions. Like, how good enough am I? And the reality is that for your very existence, you're infinitely worthy. Like, I can't put a price tag on you. Like, I really can't put a price tag. I can't. Can you put a price tag on somebody, like on your friend, for example? Like, you couldn't, right? And so that in itself just shows that actually there is no that there's people are just they're human beings, right? There's a reason why we call them beings. And we are all connected in some way in the universe. And for that very nature, there is no condition in terms of how worthy we are. We are infinitely worthy, but a lot of people sadly get programmed otherwise. And so it's really about reversing that and really about taking that initial step to connect to themselves in order to heal.
Right. Like the ego takes over.
Mm.
So anyways, thank you so much for being here today.
Um, I
Oh,
wanted to ask one
Oh my
question.
God, yeah, sure, sure, sure.
oh, hiya.
Um, yeah, I'm Henrietta, from Ghana. I want
Uh,
to ask, how can you unlove someone you really, really love and attached to, but the person treats you very bad? The person doesn't show you love. By the end of the day, you're attached to him. He made you attached to him, and now he's not really paying attention to you, treating you bad, making you feel your mental health is at stake. What do you do about that
yeah,
with such
yeah,
person?
yeah. First of all, just thank you for sharing that, because I can see how painful that situation would be. And the thing that I really want you to hold in mind is that sadly, we can never control what other people do or don't do. And sometimes we really want to be able to control elements of it because we want them to see that actually we're suffering. We want them to see that we really care and that they're disappointing us. But sadly, sometimes people, we can't control other people. The only thing that we really have control over is ourselves. And the
So,
biggest thing I would say
so
really,
in that case, what do you think is suitable for the girl to do or the person in that situation to do?
yeah, yeah. And so the first thing is really doing work on yourself in terms of connecting to how good enough you are. And so that might be things like um, really examining any time that you have doubted how good enough you are. For example, like they've not messaged me back, or they hate me because I'm not pretty enough, I'm not clever enough, I'm not this enough, I'm not this. And I really want you to kind of examine all of those. So label them and examine them and really explore, actually, are any of these really true? Or so literally asking yourself the question, is this true, or is this a story I have been told? Because more often than not, we adopt these stories from other people and we believe that it's our own, but it really isn't. This story of us not being good enough is a projection of someone else. So what I mean by that is, for example, if the guy isn't messaging, if he's ignoring, if he's being abusive, critical, all of these things, that's not what you're doing. That's all his
But,
action.
but the thing is that at the end of the day, when you are with him, it's very different. He tells you he loves you in your ears and all that, makes you feel like he's not going anywhere and all that. But at the end of the day, when you are not with him, he starts to act up, not getting time and all that, but doesn't want you to be, doesn't want you to go anywhere or to be with another guy, but just him. But at the end of the day, he's treating you so badly with your mental health, your feelings, abusing your feelings and all that. He doesn't care. But at the end of it, he doesn't want you to move on.
Yeah, yeah.
In
And
that
so what I
situation.
would, yeah, and so what I would do is I would invite you to collect all evidence of what's actually happening. So you're telling me now he has been like this. He tells me that he loves me, but he's also abusive. So I want you to just acknowledge that this is his behavior. And so he is capable to tell me that he loves me, but he's also capable of abusing me. He is capable of both of these things. And so I want you to ask yourself as a third person. So if you were to imagine that you were looking at yourself, or you were looking at someone in this situation, you were looking at someone who's examining both these parts. So he can be this, but he can also be this. And I just would invite you to make a choice on if you want to continue to be in contact with someone who can be loving, but who can also be abusive. And so I would like to, and I'm telling you to do this, looking at yourself as a third person, as like a separate person compared to about being you. Because whenever we personalize it, whenever we say like, oh yeah, but then I love him, oh, but then there's this, and then if we personalize it, it's really hard to look at it objectively. It's really hard for us to really know the answer, because we get pulled in by our emotions. But if we're able to just take a step back and look at this person who is involved with someone who is this, who's loving but also abusive, then we can ask, does this person want to actually be in a relationship with someone who can both be loving and abusive? And so I would invite you to look at it as information and as evidence that he can be loving, but he can also be attacking. And if you're seeing it as evidence, then you can make an informed choice. Because if you're seeing it as emotion, if you're involved in it and you're looking at it from first person, you're going to get pulled in into both directions, and you're going to remain in that situation for a really long time, as opposed to committing one way or the other.
Is it okay? Okay. Is it okay to ask someone where you stand in a relationship? Is it really good to ask someone where you stand in a relationship, like between you and him? Like you want to know where you stand in the relationship. Let's say you've been in a relationship for almost you've been in a relationship for almost 3 years to 4 years. The guy hasn't added anything. By the end of the day, in your mental health, he has helped you to know yourself so much. By the end of the day, he treats you so badly, and then you want to really get to know how this man is he really into you? By the end of the day, he doesn't give you attention. But the moment he gets to know that you are getting another attention from a man, that's when he comes in. That's when he calls you. That's when he put in. But when you are there with him, he doesn't want to make any effort. What do you do?
Yeah.
Do you let go?
And do you have the strength to let go? No, I'm asking you, do you have the strength to let go?
No, it's not working. I've tried so many times. It's not working. I've tried on my own hardship, trying to stay away from this.
And so this is, so this is exactly what we've been talking about earlier, is the fact that a lot of people struggle to take that step to commit because you're in love with the love that he gives, the love that he shows, and there's something really attractive about that. Whereas actually
and the funny part is, I don't get money from this person. He doesn't give me money. He doesn't like do anything in financial, but here we are. I really, really love him, and I really, really, I'm so committed to the extent I don't even have any feelings for any other guy. Any guy who comes to my way, I don't even feel anything for that person. You get it? I'm so attached to that, but by the end of the day, he's maltreating me, and then he's abusing me and all that, just because I'm in love with him and I always choose him.
Mind if I add something?
Please.
You know what really used to help me breaking my trauma bonds? Would you let let's say your best friend was in your situation right now, or like a sibling, or let's say your child.
You're talking about a best friend. Here we are. This guy has sucked everybody around from you. He has just pushed everybody to the extent all your family members are saying you should just pull away from him. But here we are. He has gather all the way to tell you to stay away from all of them, so that he can just go on and treat you and kill you. To the extent this morning, I called and I asked him why he doesn't want to kill me. What the fuck is wrong with him? He's just saying anything he wants. He hasn't done anything. To him, he doesn't see that he's really, really torturing me, killing me slowly and all that.
I know I can't really label anyone on the internet just like out of that, but it sounds a lot like narcissistic traits, I feel. I don't know. It's the whole push and pull game sounds a lot like that, but I would say I used to make like a list of like goods and bads. So every time like I would have like this sort of dissonance, I would just start looking at the list of the bad things in the relationship. So you no, like it really because you
Yeah,
start
no, but it's not even, yeah, because the thing is that when you're in that state of mind, you really struggle to look at the evidence. And so when I'm telling you to look at the fact that he's able to be this, but he's also able to be that, and I want you to take it as information that actually he is abusive, but also the fact that you remaining in that situation means that you are allowing yourself to be abused.
What if it's the love that's making me do that? Because I myself, I wish I'm out, but I can't. I always try to stay away, then something tries to pull me in. Like I'm so much in love with this person.
And so that's
I'm finding ways to get out from this relationship. That's the most important thing that I need now. Trying to get away from this person.
I mean, what I can suggest, if you wanted to find me on Instagram so that we can continue this conversation, because I can see just how painful this is for you, if that's okay. I don't know if you have me on Instagram. I'm at, do you have me on Instagram? Or maybe, I don't know if it can be shared somewhere, but
I will share it on the members, and it's you do follow Reframing You, right? I keep tagging Dr. Sarah all the time, but
all right, okay, so
I will send you the
okay, perfect. But yeah, if you wanted to drop me a message there and we can talk about it in a bit more detail, if that's okay, because I can see how stuck you are right now.
I'm so sorry.
Perfect.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
sending you so much love. Sending you so much love. All right. Well, I just want to thank everyone for coming, and thank you so much, Ashra, for doing this for us. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I really appreciate this program. Thank you. God bless you.
I will send you the Instagram to Dr. This, and as for you, Dr. Sarah, I will keep promoting you all the time. I really
so sweet.
you
So sweet.
deserve so much recognition, and I really hope you make it to the top.
Oh, bless you. So sweet. Thank you so much for today.
Thank you so much, and I will send you the Instagram. Thank you. Have a lovely
All right, take care.
Bye.